Hey everyone, Blue Squadron here with the third episode of our customized YT-1300. That's going to be a tournament trophy for the Austin, Texas X-Wing Championship. In this video, we're going to modify the dorsal side of the Millennium Falcon hull. First thing I'm doing is removing the plastic inside of the mandibles with a Dremel grinding tool. In previous Millennium Falcon models, I didn't need to do this because I was using magnet wire to solder in an LED to replace the headlight assembly. However, in this model, what I'm going to do is run fiber optics to make two small headlights in each mandible. I could have maybe done 3 fiber optics per headlight, but I wasn't confident that I could squeeze all those fiber optics into each mandible, so that's why I chose to only do 2. I need to make sure that there is enough room for the fiber optics to pass into the mandible itself, and then out through the headlight plastic. To drill the fiber optic holes, I thought I'd use a new tool, in this case a pin vise, which is basically a hand drill that you can order on Amazon for about $10 with some tiny drill bits. After a lot of effort though, I figured out that these drill bits aren't that sharp and they're not going to go through the plastic on these models. So I went to my fallback, which is a micro drill bit on a power Dremel. It works a lot better, and even though it's not necessarily going to be as straight as doing it by hand with a pin vise, frankly, I just wasn't really getting anywhere with the pin vise. After doing a couple holes in that first headlight, I went ahead and tried out a fiber optic cable, and it goes in perfectly into the mandible. I thought maybe for a few minutes that I could thread the fiber optics around the posts that hold the top and bottom halves of the hull together, but it turns out that it puts a pretty steep angle on the fiber optics themselves, and I ended up just removing those posts anyway. What it does mean, though, is that later on when I seal up the Falcon, I'm going to have to make sure that I use silicone glue instead of super glue. The reason is because cyanoacrylate, which is super glue or Gorilla Glue gel, will actually eat through the plastic fiber optics. I did think for a minute that maybe I could drill in a channel for the fiber optics to go through closer to the inside of the mandibles, but I ended up deciding to just cut away the posts that hold the Falcon together completely. At this point, I didn't quite know where the fiber optics were going to go to, as in where the LED that's driving them was going to be placed inside of the hull, so it was better to leave myself some options and some leeway for the fiber optics to bend to possibly the other side of the Falcon. So after doing the right side, I went ahead and repeated the process with the left side, cut away all the plastic, and then used my micro drill and Dremel to drill in the headlight holes for the fiber optics. It's worth noting that you're going to want to be really careful because the plastic is pretty thin on both sides of the hull, especially on the lower half. So you'll notice that for the lower half, I'm using my flush cutters to just cut away those plastic posts rather than trying to use a power tool, which may end up going completely through the hull. The next step is to drill a hole where the radar dish goes, because I'm putting in a tactile push button so that you can depress the radar and then change the targeting indicator LEDs. After going through with the top side with the drill, I decided to use some flush cutters to cut away the remaining plastic on the underside of the top half of the hull. All that plastic would have interfered with me installing one of those tactile push button switches. They're square, about 6 millimeters by 6 millimeters, and have 4 legs sticking out. So you'll see that in a second. I'm widening the round hole and trying to make it as square as possible, and in between steps I'm going to check the fit against the tactile push button switch, which once again is square. It's very easy to cut too much in one direction for that hole. I'm sure I mentioned this in my previous video series about doing a Lancer Pursuit craft where I did a similar installation of a push button switch, but my buddy who does machining in a machine shop says that it's almost impossible to cut anything square simply because every tool that you're using in a machine shop is probably going to be some type of rotary tool. You'll notice that I made the hole a little bit too large, so when I try to fit in that push button switch, it doesn't fit snugly and falls right out when I place a radar dish on top of it. To make the radar dish sit at the proper height, I'm going to have to remove a little bit of plastic from the base of the dish. So you remember that antenna that I broke off in the first video? Well, now's the time where I have to basically pin everything together. The antenna to the dish to the button. So that basically means drilling. And once again, I gave the pin vise another try. In theory, this is what a pin vise is made for. Tiny drill bits and hand precision. Unfortunately, once again, the pin vise bits weren't sharp enough to cut into the Millennium Falcon plastic. I took a gamble and decided to go back to the Dremel and the drill bit, and I was really afraid at this point that I was really just going to drill straight into my finger. I didn't, it worked, and I went ahead and drilled a hole in both the radar dish and the push button switch. Since the drill bit is basically the exact size of the hole that I was trying to make, I decided that I was going to use the drill bit as the pin to pin everything together. I did learn a hard lesson though. Drill bits are very hard. In fact, I dented my flush cutters just trying to clip one off. It's much easier to break off a drill bit than it is to clip it with those flush cutters. Once I had my pin, I went ahead and screwed it into the antenna and then through the radar dish. To install the radar dish on the push button, I actually had to install the push button first, gluing it onto the underside of the top half of the hull. After fitting the assembly together just to make sure that the push button actually does push down, I went ahead and used super glue to glue everything into place, including some on the threads of the drill bit that I'm using as a pin. That's what's holding the antenna right now. So the hard part's over, and I can just let that dry before moving on to install the push button switch. While waiting for the radar dish to dry, I went ahead and started working on the holes that are going to be the fiber optic targeting indicators. Once again, the pin vise just isn't hard enough to go through the Falcon's plastic. The pin vise did make some indentations that I used as guides for when I switched over to a Dremel and the micro drill bit. If you want to do it freehand, however, I'm sure you could use the lines that are coming out from the center of the Falcon like spokes. The left and right and the front and rear lines are pretty symmetrical. I ended up going with 2 holes on each side, and that's simply because I wanted to make sure that there weren't too many fiber optics that I'd have to squeeze into the Falcon's body. So when you see the front arc and the rear arc, each one will have 2 fiber optic indicators. At this point, the radar dish is dry enough for me to go ahead and start working with it and the push button switch. Since the hole's too large, I'm using green stuff that I'm going to wrap around the push button switch to fill in the gaps, and then use super glue to hold it in place, just like I did with the power port on the bottom half of the Falcon's hull. Orientation of the switch does matter somewhat because the switch actually has 2 poles. In other words, 2 of the legs are connected to each other and aren't actually affected by the switch. They're the same pole. So you have to make sure that the sides that are 2 different poles are basically facing inward so that you can connect it to the microcontroller hardware. It's really important not to have excess glue on the top side because that's basically where the button would push in. If any glue gets inside of there, then you don't have a button. You just have a static radar dish. To make sure that no glue gets into the inside of the button, I made sure to apply only a small amount of glue to the base of the radar dish and not directly to the button. That's it for the plastic modifications in the top half of the Falcon. Join me in the next video when I start soldering some LEDs into the controller. Thanks for watching!